Old Q, new Q, red Q, blue Q. Because he's sad. This is a review of the classic Star Trek Voyager episode, Death Wish. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. And hey, as I sit here making this video, it's only been a few weeks since I summarized most of this episode for my What Does Star Trek Actually Say About Euthanasia video. So now I've got to come up with new jokes. I love that. The episode begins with Voyager encountering a comet, which I always regard as a good omen, but some of the more precise viewers have pointed out that this object is not actually a comet. It's been made in the form of a comet, but it's not one. It's a false comet. Which means the Star Trek rule of comets, which clearly states that any episode of any Star Trek series which involves a comet can be reasonably expected to be an excellent episode, may not apply here. It also raises another equally provocative question. Does the rule cut both ways? If Death Wish does turn out to be an excellent episode, don't you love how I'm acting like I haven't seen the episode? It's fun, right? Does that then also mean that the comet-like object we see at the beginning is, in fact, a genuine comet? I'll have to give that careful consideration before reaching a verdict. Anyway, everybody's all excited about the comet, or whatever it is, and Janeway tells B'Elanna to beam aboard a sample for them to study. But what she beams aboard is this strange but pleasant fellow who walks through the force field around the transporter pad as though it's a Trump border fence and announces himself as Q. Janeway hears that and she's like, oh no, they're bringing in shit from TNG. This is bad. Are the ratings down? Are the writers out of ideas? Already? We're only like 2/3 of the way through season 2. They expect to wring 7 years out of this thing somehow? Stay there, B'Elanna. I'm on my way. But new Q cuts to the chase by using his powers to just magic everybody to the mess hall. Janeway thinks he's the Q from TNG, but new Q corrects her, explaining that he's been held prisoner inside of that comet-like object, but now, thanks to Janeway and the crew of Voyager, he's free! And oh hey, here's a fun fact, the one thing he wants more than anything else is to die. So he gives a little speech, delivers what he hopes will be meaningful last words, and attempts to off himself with a swish of his hand. He doesn't do the finger snap, he does a swish thing with his hand. I guess it's like signature moves with wrestlers. Everybody knows the snap is Original Q's thing. If Original Q is on the show, you don't do the snap unless you're trying to start shit. New Q does his move, but instead of ending his own life, he makes all of the men on the ship disappear. Janeway's like, you'd better bring them back or the budding gamer gators in the audience are gonna lose their shit. But new Q can't figure out how to bring them back. He didn't make them disappear on purpose, and as a result, they're just kinda gone. New Q is like, oh well, and magics everybody to the bridge. Oh well isn't good enough for Janeway, though. She demands her crew be returned. New Q is like, who would have more recent experience with humans? And then Original Q pops in, and he's like, who let you out of your prison, Comet? And why did you bring these humans to the Delta Quadrant? They're not supposed to be here yet. I hate when people bring humans early to the Delta Quadrant. And did you do the snap when you used your powers? Because if you did, so help me. New Q denies having anything to do with Voyager being in the Delta Quadrant, and Janeway fesses up to being responsible for releasing him. Original Q brings the men back from oblivion, then he's like, that's what we get for letting a woman be the captain. And then he turns to the camera and goes, am I right, fellas? Notice how I, the antagonist, am expressing your misogynist opinions? Take all the time you need. Never mind, we don't have that kind of time. New Q requests asylum aboard Voyager. Original Q is like, yeah, right. How is some woman, and a human woman at that, gonna protect you from me? And then they play a fun little game of hide and seek, where New Q takes Voyager to the Big Bang, shrinks it down to subatomic size, and turns it into a Hallmark Christmas ornament, only for Original Q to find them every time. They wind up back where they started, and Captain Janeway proposes that instead of playing space-time tag forever, they have a hearing to determine whether or not she will grant New Q's asylum request and agree to accept the result of the hearing in order to resolve their conflict. Both Q's agree, and well, folks, looks like we got ourselves a courtroom episode. Or should I say a courtroom episode? Courtroom with a Q episode. Actually, a courtroom with 2 Q's, which doesn't work. Let's just go with Courtroom. New Q recruits Tuvok to be his lawyer at the hearing, while original Q acts as his own lawyer in accordance with that old saying, the one who represents themselves in court has a genius for a client and can't possibly lose. And original Q opens strong. As the hearing begins, New Q asserts his right to choose the path of his own life, even if that path ends in death. But original Q counters that New Q's selfish wish for mortality could endanger all of Q's society. Original Q calls himself to the witness stand, where he testifies that immortality is one of the defining traits of Q existence, and a Q individual being allowed to choose to end their own life would change the nature of that existence in ways that can't even be predicted. Tuvok challenges original Q on the fact that the Q continuum does occasionally execute individual Q who are judged to be irredeemable criminals, asking if he sees it as a contradiction that Q society bans the taking of one's own life under all circumstances, but practices capital punishment. Original Q is like, nah. Original Q asks Captain Janeway's permission to call witnesses who will testify to the importance of New Q's life, the life New Q wishes to discard so carelessly, witnesses who will represent but a small portion of the many, many individuals whose own lives have been enriched by the involvement of New Q, witnesses from Janeway's own home planet Earth. Janeway says, sure, go ahead. Original Q snaps his fingers, and his witnesses appear. A 1960s hippie named Maury Ginsberg, legendary mathematician and physicist Isaac Newton, and fan service cameo Commander William Riker. Janeway's like, oh, Jesus, Riker's in this too? Are our ratings really that bad? I mean, I know we bring up the rear in our time slot, but we're on UPN. That's barely even a network. We'd reach a bigger audience if the episodes were sold individually as Viewmaster discs, but that's not my fault, for Christ's sake. What do they expect? Anyway, all 3 witnesses tell basically the same story. Their lives all took a turn for the better after an encounter with New Q. The apple that fell on Newton's head was knocked loose by New Q jostling the tree. Maury was part of the lighting crew at Woodstock, and he also spotted a problem with the sound system that jeopardized the entire show, and he never would have made it there if New Q hadn't given him a lift after his van broke down, and Riker... Well, okay, Riker's story is a little different, because New Q didn't make Riker's life take a turn for the better so much as he made it take a turn for the happening. New Q was imprisoned for the last 300 years, so he missed all of William Riker's life, but around, 500 years ago, New Q was on Earth, where he took part in the American Civil War and encountered Colonel Thaddeus Riker, pictured here. Colonel Riker, as Commander Riker explains, commanded Union troops as part of Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Commander Riker says Colonel Riker was wounded at Pine Mountain, which would have been before the Army actually reached Atlanta, but nonetheless, he presumably helped to destroy railroads essential to supplying the Southern Army, and no doubt the men he commanded went on to take part in the siege that ultimately led to the fall of one of the last remaining transportation and industrial hubs of the Confederacy. In other words, he was a goddamn hero. Marching with General Sherman, exorcising the curse of secesh from the land with hails of holy musket balls and conflagrations of cleansing fire. And he was wounded, and New Q carried him off the battlefield to safety. Original Q is like, and this is the meaningful and consequential life which New Q will throw away if he is granted his request and made mortal. New Q reminds Captain Janeway that if original Q gets his way, he will spend the rest of his life imprisoned in that comet, and what's the point of that? New Q uses his powers to transport all the parties at the hearing inside his comet-like prison to demonstrate how intolerable his living conditions are. Janeway's like, yep, I get it. This place is so small, there's just barely enough room for UPN's entire primetime audience. No wonder this episode is so loaded. Janeway tells New Q she's sympathetic, but she agrees with original Q on a couple of important points. One, even though the quality of life in his confinement is undeniably low, he's only been confined to prevent him from trying to off himself. And two, apart from that which is the direct result of his confinement, New Q doesn't seem to be suffering at all, let alone to such a degree that it would warrant euthanasia to end that suffering. The hearing takes a recess, and Janeway calls original Q to her ready room to see if there's some compromise that can be reached, where new Q isn't faced with either death or eternal confinement in the center of a stellar object which may or may not be a comet. Original Q is like, no, not really, but I do have an offer of my own to make. You make a ruling that is favorable to the Q continuum, and, well, just look out the window. Janeway looks out the window like, oh, it's the blue marble photograph taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts. You know, a lot of people prefer Earthrise, but this one is actually my favorite photo of Earth taken by an Apollo astronaut. And damn, it looks like you blew it up to actual size. Dude, are you saying if I rule in your favor, I get to keep this? Meanwhile, New Q talks the case over with Tuvok, and when the hearing resumes, after getting Janeway and original Q to agree, New Q whisks them all away to the Q continuum itself, so he can show Janeway why he finds his continued existence so intolerable. The Q continuum, visualized as a run-down gas station by the side of a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, doesn't seem like a very happening place. The others we see seem pretty bored, but they aren't obviously suffering. But New Q explains that it's been like this for millennia. Sure, Q have the power to travel the universe to visit any time and place they wish, but they've all been around for so long that they've done everything there is to do and said everything there is to say. The only interesting things to have happened lately have been New Q's advocacy for the right to die, which got him locked up, and original Q's disruptive antics, which have apparently ceased since he reformed and became an agent of the continuum. My life's work is complete, New Q says, but the state is forcing immortality on me. Doing that doesn't sanctify life, it cheapens it. When life has become meaningless and unendurable to the person living it, it must be allowed to end. He asks Captain Janeway, if you had nothing left to explore, nothing new to discover, would you want to live forever under those circumstances? They return to Voyager, and Janeway adjourns to consider her decision. That night, original Q pops into her bedroom, apparently coming straight from dress rehearsal for his role as Ebenezer Scrooge in a community theater production of A Christmas Carol, and informs Janeway that the Continuum have reconsidered and will agree to end New Q's confinement if Janeway rules in their favor. Janeway doesn't seem impressed by these efforts to influence her ruling, or by original Q's clumsy efforts at flirtation, and she tells him to get lost. The next day, Janeway delivers her ruling. She finds in favor of New Q. Though she doesn't personally approve of what he wants to do, and though she is concerned by the possible ramifications his death could have on Q's society, she cannot justify the state forcing immortality on people. So she grants New Q asylum. Original Q reluctantly abides by the ruling and makes New Q mortal. But even though he now has the power to fulfill his death wish, Janeway urges New Q to consider it carefully. He's never experienced life as a mortal, and that life might be worth exploring for a little while before he gives it up. But then New Q is like, nah, I'm good, and eats poison like the next day. He dies in sickbay, expressing his gratitude to Janeway right before he goes, and then original Q pops in to confess that it was he who gave New Q the poison with which to end his life because he admired New Q's irrepressible spirit. And now he wants to honor that spirit by going back to being a shit-starting, capricious trickster god. And if the Continuum doesn't like it, they can suck my Q-ock. Later! And he disappears. leaving Janeway standing there to ponder what's occurred, like, maybe new Q was right. Maybe sometimes death is the way. Like, if I ever lost someone, but I could kill someone else to bring them back. Bring back someone like you, Tuvok. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The end. So, as you could probably guess, if you didn't already know, this was a sweeps episode. It originally aired in February of 1996, and the appearances of Q and Commander Riker were attempts to goose the ratings of Voyager, which, as a rule, were extremely low compared to other network shows. And it worked. Sort of. For its original broadcast, Death Wish drew almost 10 million viewers, which still left it in last place for its time slot, but was also the second highest rated Voyager episode of that season, second only to the season premiere. And by the way, just to demonstrate how dramatically television has changed in the last 25 years or so, an audience of 10 million viewers today would make it a top 5 show. Last week, Monday Night Football didn't draw 10 million viewers. TV networks would kill for a scripted show that consistently drew 10 million viewers on the night. Most don't even get close to that number when you factor in DVR viewers. It's a different world. But that's just some trivia, which I find interesting. What really matters here isn't how many people watched this episode when it debuted, but the content and quality of the episode itself. Death Wish is often cited as one of Voyager's better efforts, and with good reason. Sure, it's nice to see Q, and I'm sure some non-regular viewers were intrigued by the possibility of Q serving as a foil for Captain Janeway, now that Picard and the TNG crew had graduated to the movies. However, one of the bravest and best choices made by Michael Piller, who wrote this episode from an idea conceived by his son, Sean Piller, is to not make this a typical Q episode. Fans tuning in expecting to see Q tormenting the crew of Voyager with his usual mercurial methods didn't get that. Hopefully, they were pleased with what they did get, though. A story about an issue that matters socially and philosophically, told through characters arguing their respective cases to each other. It's a story told through dialogue and performance. It's the essence of drama. With a few minor changes and a bit of creative stagecraft, you could do this episode as live theater. It's not an action-packed episode, it's not a thrilling space adventure, and it doesn't need to be. These characters, these performances, these words are all it needs. Speaking of those performances, Garrett Graham as New Q is just fantastic here. This is a tricky character to play because he spans such a broad range of emotions in such a short period of time. He has to go from comical to deeply earnest and seem authentic the whole way through, and Graham pulls it off. His Q is funny, impish, instantly likable, but he's also wise and thoughtful, and when the time comes for him to take over from Tuvok and argue his case personally to Janeway, he proves to be an intelligent, passionate advocate for himself. And I know I made fun of it, but I really like the little hand motion he came up with to indicate the use of his powers. I like the idea of other Qs having their own thing instead of just doing the snap like John Delancey's Q does. And Graham's motion works really well because it allows him to indicate effort. So when his powers aren't working right, or when he loses his powers at the end, he can go like this. And it looks like he's trying to do something, but failing. A small touch, but very effective. The other guest star in the episode is the aforementioned John Delancey as original recipe Q, and he gets to stretch his legs a bit here. We get little touches of the more familiar smartass Q, but unlike most of his previous appearances, his role here is not to be the agent of chaos, but the advocate for the status quo. He still does wacky things like examine himself on the witness stand and summon other witnesses from throughout human history, and demonstrates a willingness to go to underhanded lengths to get his way by bribing Janeway with a return trip to Earth if she rules in his favor. But this time, he's fighting to uphold the rules, not to break them. And the episode is smart enough to acknowledge that, make it part of the story, and use it to give Q a character arc, which, Deja Q aside, he never really gets in other episodes. He realizes how much he's changed, how well-behaved he's become, and uses the example of new Q as inspiration to return to his rebellious ways. Most of the provocative and inappropriate behavior Q does exhibit in this episode is directed at Captain Janeway, and this is another way in which Michael Piller shows off what a smart writer he is. As I mentioned in a previous review, because of the nature of the character, Q, when written with some cleverness and creativity, can be used to make self-referential jokes that don't fall to the level of obvious pandering. Throughout Death Wish, Q demeans and ridicules Janeway for being a woman. The sexist and misogynist comments he makes mirror actual comments that were being made by regressive, reactionary Trekkies at the time. And Q saying such things to Janeway's face gives Janeway the opportunity to respond. And her response is, she's not impressed. Which is appropriate, since chauvinistic men who attempt to make virtues out of their backwards, degrading, pig-headed attitudes toward women are always the least impressive people. This being essentially a courtroom episode invites comparisons to TNG, which Voyager was constantly doing anyway, usually to its detriment, but the visit to the Q continuum also reminds me of classic Star Trek. I can visualize Kirk, Spock, and McCoy finding themselves on that dusty road, wandering around, trying to make sense of what they're seeing. The Q continuum is the native realm of a race of gods. What could that possibly be like? It's a complex, difficult-to-imagine concept, and Death Wish, in classic Star Trek fashion, finds a way to present it in a way that is simple, easy to comprehend, and packed with symbolism. I particularly like the detail of the new being styled in a manner reminiscent of the 1920s. The woman is dressed like a flapper. The magazine's title is printed in an Art Deco font so that it registers with contemporary viewers and the 24th century characters as being out of date, which reinforces New Q's argument about the intolerable stagnation of existence in the continuum. Finally, I admire the episode for not chickening out on the ending. It would have been easy to have New Q, or Quinn as he names himself after gaining his mortality, live through this episode. Having him join the Voyager crew as a new regular or recurring character probably wasn't an option from a production point of view, and I'm skeptical it would have helped the show or his character from a creative point of view either, but they could have had him request to be dropped off on some nearby inhabited planet or transfer to a ship operated by some Delta Quadrant species which Voyager passes by and setting off to begin his new mortal life. But the episode doesn't do that. It finishes the story it started. It gives Quinn's character the resolution he's been seeking all along. His fight has been to end his own life, and when he wins that fight, that's just what he does. He ends his life. It's sad. It's a disappointment to Janeway and the others, and perhaps even to some of us in the audience, but it's what Quinn wanted. And that's the point. You know, when I think about it, there's not really much I can fault this episode for. There are a few exceptionally minor issues I could mention. That first scene at the asylum hearing is really, really long. The opening statements, Q calling himself as a witness, Tuvok's cross-examination, the appearances of Riker, Newton, and the hippie, the visit to New Q's Comet prison. There's a commercial break in there, but it's all one scene. It's kind of a behemoth. There's a bit of inconsistency regarding the nature of Q existence. Are they linear or non-linear? Because if they're non-linear, as it's usually been suggested they are, at least relative to mortal existence, why does New Q being held in captivity for the past 300 years mean he can't possibly have interacted with Commander Riker? And as much as I like the guy, Riker's presence here is pure fan service. There's no reason at all for Riker to appear in this episode other than to get Trekkies to go, "Hey, it's Riker!" His presence is barely justified within the story itself. New Q saved one of his ancestors in a war 500 years ago. Come on. And there are other flaws here and there, but like I said, they are minor and inconsequential. They do not affect my opinion of the episode one bit. What is my opinion of the episode? My final verdict? That's definitely a real comet. Those are my thoughts on Death Wish. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me again next week as this batch of Q episode reviews continues. Next time, I'll be reviewing Q's second appearance on Star Trek Voyager in an episode titled The Q and the Gray. See you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.